Part 4 of McCloskey's 1983 article is entitled "The Unofficial Rhetoric is Honourable but Unexamined." In this section, McCloskey doesn't focus much on why the unofficial rhetoric is honourable, but rather makes the point that it's unexamined and that economists are to some extent still in the thrall of a modernist understanding of economics as a science, and this leads to some unfortunate consequences. So, part A of this section is econometric rhetoric is too narrow. McCloskey says that agreement in economics is not based on theoretical deduction or surveys of the evidence. So, for example, many economists believe that imposing a price ceiling on rental accommodation leads to a shortage in rental accommodation and a degradation in the quality of the available rental accommodation. So why do many economists agree with that idea? She says it's not because it has been theoretically deduced by everyone, and they're all in agreement on that, because you can construct all sorts of theoretical models of rental accommodation markets which can show all sorts of different conclusions. And equally, most economists don't believe it because they've scoured all of the literature and collected together all of the evidence that's available and come to a determination that rent controls create shortages, for example. Rather, the real reasons for consensus and also the real reasons for disagreements between economists remain unexamined. In consequence, the official rhetoric of modernism pops up in mischievous ways. McCloskey says, let's take the quote-unquote ceremony of hypothesis, regression, test, publish. That is, you formulate a hypothesis, you run regressions for the dependent and independent variables, you test for significance, and then if you found a significant result, then you publish, if possible. McCloskey points out that it's an open secret in econometric studies that if curve fitting fails, then what one will do is, before publication, one will modify one's initial hypothesis or modify the specifications of the model or the equation that one's using, and you keep modifying it until you get statistically significant results for a publishable article. So all of that modification that's going on in the background, so to speak, or in the back room, is never revealed officially. So when the article is written up, it's presented as if it was a one-shot discovery, rather than there was a lot of massaging of the hypothesis or the functional form of the equation or something like that. She points out, but the significant result does not have the significance it claims if the hypothesis has been manipulated to fit the data. So it's no surprise that we find so many articles reporting statistically significant results, despite the fact you have many articles reporting statistically significant results that contradict each other, or appear to contradict each other. McCloskey doesn't explicitly say this herself, but people like Ed Lima make the point that it leads to a credibility deficit. That is, no one really believes the econometric results have been discovered in the way in which it has been presented in published form, and that you could reconstruct the study and come up with a different result if you so desired. So the question is, should we try and be more modernist in our approach? That is, should we try and be even stricter than we have been? So just as a simple example, you'd say, instead of having a p-value being less than 5% or less than 1%, let's get even stricter and make it less than 0.1%, something like that. Is that the way we solve this problem? And McCloskey says, no, that's not how you're going to solve the problem. What we should really do instead is look for reasonable improvements in methods that would serve to genuinely persuade practitioners of the real significance of findings. So it's not simply a matter of maintaining the same official rhetoric or the same official story of the scientific method, just tightened up, but rather we need to think about, well, how are economists really persuading each other? It's not actually by this method, it's by other means. And that's what we really should be focusing on. Now, she also says that it's not enough to say that people have powerful prior beliefs, and this would explain their disagreements or their agreements. So there's common powerful prior beliefs that lead to agreement amongst economists, or there are conflicting powerful prior beliefs amongst economists leading to disagreement on empirical matters. She says this isn't really satisfactory. I mean, it's not a bad start. If we can think of it in Bayesian terms, you've got your priors, you collect evidence, and it modifies your beliefs in the light of that evidence, be it positive or negative. She says, well, that's not a bad start, but we really need to go beyond that. You need to look at the rhetorical context in which those priors, those powerful prior beliefs, came into existence. And we might also want to say, well, what are the rhetorical standards or the rhetorical context that leads different economists to give different weight to the empirical evidence that comes in. She goes on to give an example of the controversy over purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is basically the idea that there is say we've got two currencies for two different countries, that there is an equilibrium exchange rate for those currencies, such that you could purchase the same quantity of a given homogeneous basket of goods in either one of those countries with the whichever currency you chose. That is to say, the purchasing power of each currency, the amount each currency can buy, is identical in the two countries. So a simple fun example of that is the Big Mac index, which is created by the Economist magazine, so it would basically say that the ratio of the price of a Big Mac in Australia relative to the price of a Big Mac in the United States will be equal to the equilibrium exchange rate. That is the number of Australian dollars you could buy with $1 US. So, for example, if the price of a hamburger, a Big Mac in Australia is $4, and the price of a Big Mac in the United States is $2, then if purchasing power parity holds, then we would expect the exchange rate to be 2 to 1, that is 2 Australian dollars relative to $1 US. Anyway, so there's controversy over whether this purchasing power parity actually holds true. So according to modernist rules, everyone knows what you should do. You collect data, you test your hypothesis with given controls, and compare the data to the hypothesis. If it's correct, then you accept. If the predictions don't come out true, then you reject it. Okay, so you regress the US prices against, say, for McCloskey's example, against Canadian prices. It could be Australian prices. If the coefficient for that regression is equal to 1, then purchasing power parity is confirmed. However, she notes that about half the studies of purchasing power parity say that it's true, and about half say that it's false. So the modernist approach can't really explain why this is the case, why half the studies say it's true, half the studies say it's false. The issue here is that, of course, the coefficient is almost never exactly 1. So the issue is, how close to 1 does the coefficient have to be for us to say that PPP is true? And how far away from 1 does it have to be before we say we've disconfirmed the hypothesis of PPP? McCloskey points out that the problem is that investigators of this matter offer no explicit criteria by which they reach their conclusions that it's either true or false. That is, no good answers are given as to the question, how close is close enough to 1 in order to say it's true? Or how far away does it have to be to say it's false? There's no explicit criteria offered. McCloskey points out that it's not sufficient to just to appeal to figures of authority to say, well, McGurk says that if the coefficient is 0.95, then PPP has been confirmed, or that Joe Blow says that if it's 0.75, then it's been rejected. It's no good to appeal to these figures of authority, because that just pushes our question one step further back. It just pushes it back onto these figures of authority that have been appealed to. We haven't really answered the question. Statistical significance testing is not going to be a satisfactory criterion either, because the problem is really about economic significance, not statistical significance. That is, it's about, is the effect large enough to matter? Right? That's what's really important here, and that's what we want criteria for. And McCloskey concludes this subsection by saying, the point is to have standards of argument, to go beyond the inconclusive rhetoric provided by the pseudoscientific ceremony of hypothesis, regression, test, publish in most modern economics.